What is happening, security gang? Welcome to another Friday conversation of the CyberHub Podcast. James Azar here, your host. I've got a very exciting topic to talk about today, one that I've covered a lot during our practitioner briefs here over the last several weeks. The commute air no-fly list. The fact that the U.S. federal no-fly list was just sitting on an unsecured server somewhere by a regional airline that was a sister partner airline to United Airlines has quickly made us all rethink our responsibility to the supply chain, but also around data management and data security. That's going to be the topic of today's episode here on the Friday Conversation. I've got a very special guest joining me here in just a moment, Amit Shaked. He's the founder and CEO of Laminar, and we'll be kind of taking a deep dive into data security and everything else going on. So don't go anywhere. Let's get the Friday Conversation going. Happy Friday, y'all. Here we go.
From the CyberHub bunker and studio, you're tuning in to the CyberHub Podcast. And now for your host and CISO, James Azar.
Well, happy Friday, security gang. I've got my buddy from the other side of the ocean and he's in my favorite city in the entire freaking world. If y'all haven't been to Tel Aviv yet, I don't know what you're waiting for. Amit, good morning. Happy Friday. How's it going, buddy?
Doing great. Thanks for having me, James.
It's a pleasure to have you on. So folks who don't know Amit Shaked, let me introduce you to one of the brilliant minds here. So Amit's going to be talking to us here today about cloud transformation, data democratization, but Amit himself comes really from a whole slew of unicorns out of Israel, which is, no surprise. Recently doing some deep learning and AI for the Unicorn Magic Leap. He's also a graduate of 8200 over at the Israeli Defense Forces, focused on cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. He also holds a master's from one of my favorite universities on the planet, Tel Aviv University, with their world-renowned Cyber Week in the summer, which they got to change the date because coming to Israel at the end of July never is a good idea. But Amit is also the founder and CEO of Laminar. And so, Amit, happy Friday again. Welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Awesome. So, Amit, I want to kind of get talking a little bit about our topic today because it really is fascinating. The fact that the no-fly list ended up just sitting on an unsecured server somewhere makes me a bit nervous about the future of data security. The fast rate of change is really kind of changing and leaving security almost in the dust. What are you seeing from the fast rate of change, and what could security practitioners really be doing to keep up with the speed of change? Instead of stuff taking years, now it's taking days or weeks.
Yeah, sure. So I think we absolutely see this trend, and usually, with this such changes, it comes to three aspects: the people, process, and technology, right? And so First, in people, what you see, and this is kind of the reasons for the rapid data proliferation that we see in the cloud, but also others, is that, in people, first, you now have independent teams that kind of own their applications and own the data and can innovate fast and independently. They don't need to ask anybody else or the security team about whether or not they can make this change. In the processes, there's this data democratization that you also mentioned, right? And it's the idea that, okay, we have these independent teams. We want them to use data. We want them to leverage it more freely and to innovate and to create data-centric innovation to drive the business. And so this is fantastic, right? Every developer and engineer can now just say, go ahead and use data. And in technologies, you see dozens of new technologies in the cloud to store, use, and share data, right? Just in AWS, there are all these different acronyms. There's F3, but also RDS and EBS and EFR and EMR and many, many different types of technologies, which is, again, great because the idea is that to have a different solution for every different use case for using data, right? Structured and unstructured, real-time, SQL and NoSQL. And so what you get is that every developer or data scientist with a great idea can just go ahead and implement it, which is fantastic for the business. And obviously you want to allow it, but it's also a nightmare for security teams, right? Because the problem is today, every time the data grows, so does risk. Because when data proliferates, the data security doesn't follow. And this is also what we saw in the no-fly list zone, right? You can put all your efforts into protecting the main production database and have all your controls in place. But then as soon as the data is moved or copied to S3 bucket or any other example, all these controls don't matter anymore. It can be copied to another area or to the test or to the development. And so this is what you get, right? This data chaos. And we tend to criticize security teams or security leaders about not protecting this sensitive information hard enough, but really, what can you do, right? If you put yourself, or you were a CISO, you are a CISO, right? You know how it is, right? What can you do? You can either resist all the great trends of the cloud and say, you know what, don't innovate don't innovate that fast, or come through me every time you want to make a change. Nobody wants to be that person, right? Nobody wants to slow down business. Modern security teams are about enablement. And so you don't want to do that. You can't do anything manually, right? You have tens of thousands of data stores. You're not going to go one by one. And okay, you've tried everything you have with infrastructure and application security, but the problem is that they too don't follow the data, right? Okay, you configure that this S3 bucket is protected, but then as soon as it's copied to another, what do you do with that? And again, the problem with data is that if you focus only on the infrastructure and you say this asset is open to the public, maybe it's okay. Maybe the asset that was open to the public in the no-fly list scenario was supposed to be public because it meant to share data with business partners, with customers. The problem is that too often there's sensitive data that is sitting there that the organization didn't know about because of all the data proliferation that we just saw. And so this put CISOs and data security teams in a very big problem, right? What can you do? You don't have the proper tools.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up, I think, a few very important points, and I think I'll kind of tell you this as a CISO, right? So one, if you don't keep up with the business, if you slow down business, you're not going to be in your job for very long. Let's just start with that, right? You're likely not also going to be able to get people to champion security for you, because the moment you start telling people, no, you can't do something, is the moment they start to look for other ways to do it behind your back. You know, the no-fly list to me was, you know, Commute Air is a very, very small regional airline carrier. But the fact that TSA and DHS and DOD don't have standards for how they share the no-fly list is even more mind-boggling for me, because who's, you know, it kind of goes back to, you're only as strong as your weakest, you know, link. You know this from the military, right? Your unit's only as strong as the weakest guy in it. So, you know, the same goes here. But again, I think, you know, the other thing about this is a lot of security professionals, right? The rapid change creates a knowledge gap, right? And we're seeing things go into multi-cloud environments where it's not just AWS. You've got to know Azure. You've got to know Google Cloud. You've got to know Oracle. You may have to know your private cloud. You've got your on-prem, because not everyone, a lot of people still have on-prem. And so you're looking at these, you know, kind of adoption of cloud data storage across multiple, cloud providers. A lot of them have different configurations, different architectures. It becomes really hard to manage. How do you start to how do security professionals even start to tackle? It's hard enough knowing security. Nonetheless, now start to know every single cloud provider, every single knickknack. I mean, you were just talking about the AWS acronyms. Well, that's wonderful, but I guarantee you that half of the people that wrote those down now are Googling what they mean.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just say one thing. You said that you were surprised that they didn't have a proper policies for how to share this sensitive data. My guess is that they do have them, except that how do you enforce it, right? Because the problem is deeper than just visibility and understanding and detection. How do you enforce your policies, right? Let's say you say you can't share this information with any business partner, right? How do you make sure that no engineer or data scientist is making the mistakes? So I think it's part of the problem. Having policies in many cases is not enough. And yes, but also configuring to everything you said, right? The skills gap, especially when it comes to data, because the way traditional data teams and data security teams and privacy, right, which is a big part of this game, used to think about it, is they're not necessarily as technical as the best engineer in your organization, right? They don't know all the subtleties and the differences between all these different technologies, and they are different. The way AWS is managing access is very different from the way Azure is doing that. And in AWS are all these different technologies and all the different databases that you can run on a compute, like Postgres and MongoDB and others have different ways to manage it. And so expecting those teams to know all the differences and to keep up to date with all the changes is just impossible. Not to say that even if they know, still understanding the access is complex, because if you look at AWS, even S3 bucket, right, and you want to know who can access it, it's not easy. There's all these floor charts because there are policies at the object level, at the bucket level, there are ACLs, there are backward compatibility policies, there are organizational policies, and you have to combine everything in your head and kind of follow this flow chart to know if you can access it or not. And the reason is it's very easy for a machine to validate that, but for a human being, it's very hard. And so I think we can't really expect them to do everything manually without the proper solutions. And this is what the data security solutions, the new data security posture management tools are here to do, right? To bridge this gap of the knowledge, of the rapid proliferation, of enforcing the policies. And so, yes, I mentioned that it's hard to criticize them when you don't have the proper tools. And I think we should empathize, but our empathy is going to run out pretty quickly because now there are tools to do that. And so I feel that more and more organizations are now adopting them. So the only way to handle it is automation, right? There's no other answer.
Right. I mean, automation obviously helps bridge skill gap and knowledge gap, right? When you look at kind of the idea of multi-cloud, and, we kind of very much talked about AWS, but if you look at the challenges between, what are some of the challenges you've witnessed between kind of the on-prem to cloud posture management to the distributed workforce and so forth? What are some of the challenges you've seen there when it comes to really data management? Because, and I want to preface this, in preparing for our conversation this morning, Amit, I spent some time speaking to a lot of peers. The titles of chief data security officers, VP of data security, those are titles, we're used to AppSec and GRC. Now we've got data security, which is now seems to be its own kind of, playing field for a lot of security practitioners. How do we start to address kind of the on-prem and then the responsibilities that these data security professionals get?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think to give the most basic example for the differences between the on-prem and the cloud is if you think about sharing an internal file with a business partner. Right? In the on-prem environment, it took you months of pain and bureaucracy, and you had to change the network configuration and all that just to share this file. And in the process, there was someone that could ask you the basic questions of why do you need to share this file? What is in this file? How do you protect it? What are the proper controls? And so on. If you want to share a file in an S3 bucket, it takes you 3 clicks. And so doing that is so easy that obviously the business tends to allow engineers and data scientists to do that. if you can do it in 3 seconds, you shouldn't spend 3 months doing that. And so the major difference between the on-prem and the cloud is how easy it is, how fast it proliferates, and also the complexity and all the nuances that we talked about. And so I think there are significant differences. But the way I say it, data security is not a new problem, right? It's a very old problem, perhaps as old as data. But in the on-prem environment, it was still kind of bearable because it was the devil you know. You knew pretty much where your data centers, you had the proper controls, maybe something that protects your databases. But then you want to solve the urgent pain in the cloud. And when you do that, you also probably want to resolve the old pain in the on-prem. I think kind of cloud it's what the trigger for organizations to solve it now, and then the on-prem is another thing that they need to handle while they are solving their biggest problems. And in terms of the titles and the responsibility within the organization, I think you're touching a very interesting topic because it is still part of the debate that we hear with many executives. There's the CISO and the Chief Data Officer and the Chief Privacy Officer, and they all care about data and they all care about data security. And so understanding the RACI model, right, who's responsible, who's accountable, and so on, is something that is still on a debate. What is the right way to do that? And we see that many organizations struggle because when you have multiple owners, you have no owners. Everybody's pointing at each other saying, okay, you're supposed to do that or you. And even if you think about the visibility, right, it's something that is important for everybody, and knowing where all your data is and all your shadow data. So who's responsible for bringing this technology and implementing it, right? And so this is an ongoing debate. And I think the solution that we recommend to organizations, again, different types can have different solutions. We can talk about all the different types of organizations, but if I had to generalize, I think the answer is what you mentioned with the VP of data security. It's someone that owns data security, usually report to the CISO, and takes care of everything regarding data that is interesting for security. And so the privacy teams can also benefit from it because in many cases, they're part of the legal team. They're not as technical and they don't always know how to bring in new technology. And the CISO is the organizational expert in bringing new technology, right? They do that all the time. And so by implementing data security, they can also help their peers and be good peers and partners. Same goes for the Chief Data Officer. Sometimes they're stronger in the organization and can have tools of their own. But usually what I recommend is kind of someone senior that understands how to drive this discipline, because data security is a whole new discipline, right? It's not part of application security or part of infrastructure or part of identity. It's a whole new discipline that you need to understand and solve. So a VP of data security or director that reports to the CISO, I think, is the answer for this complexity of managing data. But as I said, it's a great question, and I think it's still an ongoing debate.
Yeah, I think this debate is going to be leading us for years to come. It's kind of like who the CISO should report to, right? Very similar debate when it comes to data security. You did bring up a good point, though. Someone has to own data security, and between a chief data officer, a chief privacy officer, a CISO, a CIO, and a CTO, you often find yourself having to navigate who's responsible to do what, where the friction there typically doesn't exist between privacy and security. Rather, this friction is between data and security, because data and data scientists want to be able to go out and do whatever they need to do in order to support the business. And security is like, hang on, don't do X, Y, and Z. And so you end up finding that friction. The ability to have someone own it and own overall data security is critical, because again, data security is a completely different threat surface. And that kind of brings about what I like to call shadow data, right? Where you're moving data around, you've got data sitting, that's how the no-fly list ended up in an S3 bucket. I mean, for the sake of accuracy, that commuter no-fly list was a no-fly list from 2019, meaning, my guess, I don't know this for sure, but I'm going to go on a wild assumption here, Amit, and correct me if I'm wrong. Some data scientist or some, engineer at Commute Air was like, we're trying something new with how we store and analyze the no-fly list, and probably maybe a new algorithm to match names versus passengers that might be boarding their flight, because that's their responsibility. and they used an old version of the no-fly list and completely forgot that the bucket was just sitting there unsecured. It's just my guess. How do you see that play out? How are you seeing the proliferation of shadow data, Amit?
Yeah, I would go with the same guess, right? And this is something we see all the time. I mean, you'd be surprised of how many temp please remove after using files we find 6 years after the original date of the file. And I think that comes to the nature of data in the cloud. It's super easy to create, to replicate, to move, to copy. It's very hard to delete, because nobody wants to be responsible for deleting a database that somebody else uses, right? So it's so much easier to just leave it there indefinitely. And then what you end up with, it's adding up risk, it's adding cost, but it doesn't add any value. So I see that the image has froze.
Yeah, your image slightly froze there. We can still hear you just fine. I'm going to give you an opportunity to reset that image real quick, Amit. We'll see if we get that here. We for those watching, so we had something similar happen here before the show got going, and so I'm sorry to have that happen, but that's the beauty and of live shows and live tech, is sometimes we have some technology challenges. And so that's the case. But to Amit's point here, while we wait for him to reset his camera and come back, is what we're seeing is oftentimes these, and Amit's back, so I'm going to bring him back into the show. Amit, I guess we got a different camera angle, buddy.
We have apologize for that, but that's part of being in a live show, right?
That's part of being on a live show, and you know what, I like these little moments, because they really test our, it's kind of like a security practitioner, where all of a sudden you have an event, right? You've got to quickly react, keep your cool, and kind of be able to go through. That's the, I say as a CISO, I've got two different types of events. One where I have an audio issue or video issue in the middle of a live show. The other one is when I have a cyber event. But going back to what you were talking about, and kind of bringing us back on track here, the proliferation of shadow data, and like you were saying, the cloud has created the ability to just stand things up. How do you start to really deal with shadow data, and where do we start to solve for shadow data so that we find it before our adversaries do?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about the problem of why we see all this shadow data, right? The proliferation and the fact that you don't want to delete it because maybe somebody else is using it. And the problem is that, okay, manual efforts won't work. You have so many data, so you can go database by database or every file and figure out what's in there. And there were traditional solutions for data security, but they were based on connectors, right? Point at the database that you want to scan, and then this solution would connect to the database, scan it, or you also had to provide the credentials and like username and password, and then it could scan it. But this also misses all the shadow data, right? If you have to point, you can't point at something you don't know that exists, because this developer copied it to the development environment, to a Net3 bucket, right? And so the only way to handle shadow data is automatic discovery and classification of all the data across your entire environment, right? Something that sits there, and every time there's a new data, it will know about this. And you as the user doesn't have to know about any change, but any change that affects you, any sensitive data that is publicly exposed, any restricted data that is accessed by a third party that you didn't plan to, you need to know as soon as it happens. And so that also allows the business to continue to innovate fast, right? You can tell data scientists and the engineers, look, build your applications, move as fast as you can, because when you do a mistake, and you will, but when you do it, we'll know about this immediately because we have proper monitoring tools. And so that's just the only way that you can really handle this shadow data and to prevent incidents like we just heard. And it's unfortunately not the only scenario of that kind, right? We hear about this sort of data breaches all the time, and you're here and you're like, how can it continue to happen? How can sensitive files can still be in Net3 buckets exposed, or any other database, right? Elastic Cache Map, many examples. The reason is all this shadow data.
Yeah, I mean, what you're bringing up, I think, is a problem that a lot of a lot of individuals, a lot of CISOs, a lot of practitioners deal with day in and day out, which is one, how do I discover data to begin with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Number two, how do I at least give myself a fighting chance to secure that data? Because we can create all the policies, right? And you see in a lot of traditional organizations, CISOs kind of have to create these policies and, go do what I like to call the auditing function, which is are people following our policy? No, they're not. All right, let's use that as a coaching opportunity. What you're talking about here is more of a proactive live feed and live approach into this world. Is that right?
Yep, absolutely right. So technology, but like everything else, people and process, right? Because
Right.
organizations need to bring the right processes to handle data security. And it sounds trivial, but in many, it still does not exist. Data security used to be a shared responsibility. But now, if you have someone dedicated, or even if you're not, you need to find the right processes. Handling data security and infrastructure security vulnerabilities or issues is not necessarily the same, because when it's data, you also need to understand the impact, right? You need to understand, was this data compromised? And so you need to build your operational workflows using technology, because it's like you would never be able to build the right workflows without automation of discovery, but also you need to understand how to use the technology proper, how to benefit from it the most. And so, yes, it comes hand in hand with that. And there are many potential owners for this, even if you don't have data security. In many cases, we see that under cloud security, just understand that they need to take care of data. Sometimes it's the internal threat, or there are many different possible ways. In many cases, data governance or privacy IT. And so this person has many names, has many titles, many hats, but the idea is the same. They should care about data security and be able to operate the technology to remediate the risk.
So Amit, what was the driver behind you actually starting Laminar? I mean, you worked in deep learning and AI. You've been in a bunch of unicorns. So you've had your share of success. Being an entrepreneur is never easy. What's the reason you kind of went on this journey?
Yeah, that's a great question that started way before I started Laminar, because to be an entrepreneur, it kind of has to be rooted into your character, because
Right.
there are so many reasons.
Your DNA. Either it's in your DNA or it's not. Yeah.
It has to be. Look, I knew that I'm going to be an entrepreneur. Like my co-founder Oran and I started to talk about this when we were 14. And so I probably knew that I'm going to be an entrepreneur before that. And at age 14, you don't know anything about anything in life, right? You don't know the risk and all the sacrifices that you'll have to make. But I knew that I want to be an entrepreneur. And even more than that, I knew that I want to be a CEO. So that's just who I am. And this is, I think, the only reason to become an entrepreneur. There are thousands of reasons why not. The only reason to start a company is if you kind of feel that you have to, if it's in your DNA, if you can't do anything else. And I was at Magic Leap before I started Laminar, and throughout my whole career, I always thought I can do this better than the current CEO. Because at Magic Leap, we've built, I think, is what is still one of the most amazing technologies to have ever been built. Right? It was this amazing ability to see physical reality and digital reality into the same space. You had a digital dragon sitting on your table, but the business side was terrible. I mean, we didn't release a product for 8 years now. As the head of AI, I could influence some of the strategy, but I was not in a position to make decisions and change the strategy. And so I knew that if I think I can do it better, I have to prove it to myself, and mostly to myself. and this is why I wanted to start a company, right? So that's about becoming an entrepreneur and a CEO. Why Laminar specifically? So the idea also came from Magic Leap, because there I process the most sensitive data. It's everything that the user can hear and see. And we moved it to the cloud, and we wanted to run an AI algorithms based on this data. And I knew that with this kind of data, there's no second chance, right? If this data leaks, nobody will use Magic Leap ever again. And so we had to come up with the best data security solution for this data, or my project will never see the light of day. And so I was looking for off-the-shelf solutions for data security, the best data security in AWS, and I just couldn't find anything that was satisfying. And so I asked my co-founder, Oran, what do they do? And he was the first employee at a startup called Medigate, who was since acquired.
Yep.
And he told me that they had exactly the same problem, right? They processed, it was a security startup in the healthcare industry, and they processed health information. No solution. And so then we just started to talk with people from the industry, right? CISOs, how do you handle data security properly in the cloud today? And when we realized that we're not the only one with this problem, we left our jobs and started Laminar.
Great story. I mean, going from, it's kind of we see that today more than ever before, is a lot of people who have challenges end up going towards the path of saying, I'm going to solve it myself. And I completely agree with that. What a brilliant story. Amit, how can people get in touch with you? What's the best way for people who have questions or want to connect? What's the best way for them to connect with you?
Sure. So first, probably the best approach is just to send me an email. It's Amit at laminarsecurity.com. I promise I'll get to it as soon as I can. We have our website with tons of materials there about data security, with webinars, with thought leadership, about everything that we discussed today and more, right? How to operationalize it, what the new technology has to offer. And so just laminarsecurity.com. We have our LinkedIn page where we usually post this new webinars if you want to stay up to date with the latest and greatest in data security. And so I would recommend that.
So also, folks, website that Amit talked about in the show notes and below. If you're watching us live, if you're watching us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, wherever, it's right there. The links are below. And then obviously Amit's LinkedIn is also there. Amit was brave enough to give his email on a live show. So you guys can email him as well and take that conversation. Amit, I want to say thank you for one, coming on the show and sharing so much. The challenge of data security is we've got a long road ahead of us, but small wins at a time leads to bigger victories. So really thanks for coming on and being part of the show. Really appreciate it, folks. That's it for our Friday show. I know there's some questions here. We'll answer those like I do on the live show. We'll go back and physically reply to your comments below. So we're not ignoring all the comments here on the side, but we do want to be mindful of your time, and we're a few minutes over here. So I want to keep that in mind for all of y'all. Thanks for tuning in, Amit. Thanks for being on the show. All right, everyone. Friday conversation. That's a wrap. I'll be back Monday, 9 a.m. live with a practitioner brief right here on YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, you name it, everything but TikTok. So you can catch us there. Make sure to subscribe. Go check out Amit and Laminar Security and the awesome team he's got there. And if you have data security questions, I couldn't think of a better person to go speak with. Till then, have a great weekend, y'all. Have a great rest of your day. And most importantly, stay cyber safe.
We love feedback, so make sure to connect with us on social media and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform.